Well, a certain big city mayor told everyone last week he was very, very, very sorry for his actions. But what if you're a staffer and you think sorry is not enough? What do you do? The insiders have that challenge tonight. Conservative Jamie Watt is in Vancouver. The NDP's Kathleen Munk is in Ottawa. And the Liberals' David Hurley is here in Toronto. All right, Jamie, you start us off. What do you do in a situation like that when you don't think sorry is enough?
Well, first of all, it's a time, Peter, when you want to make sure you've got political staff that have been around you for a long time and who you really trust to have your back. So when they tell you tough things that you don't want to hear, you might have at least a chance to listen to them. These people, actually, the good ones, learn how to tell truth to power and not get fired. And that's a very, very special, or we might say this week, a very, very, very special skill. But it's very tough to do. And you've got to sit down with your candidate or with your political leader that you're working for and tell them the truth and make sure you pound into their head what you believe. And the second thing you got to do is not fall victim to relativism. And that's what is the worst thing for political staff that have been around for a long time. They say, well, for my guy, for my woman, that's good enough or that's pretty good. Whereas the outside world says, are you kidding me? That's crazy.
Kathleen.
Yeah, well, I agree with Jamie completely that when you start to lose political staff, when you're faced with a scandal like we're seeing right now in Toronto, it may be a sign that the boss actually doesn't really want staff to tell him the truth, but in fact want that echo chamber, and that's what you don't want out of your political staff. I think the problem that faced right now, Mayor Ford is facing, is that both himself and his staff have made almost a virtue out of dealing with these attacks. He holds these attacks against him, whether it's from bicyclists or the gay and lesbian community or Labour, as almost a badge of honor. And so even though he's being attacked again now, I'm not sure if he realizes the graveness of the situation, and that's a problem.
Where are you on this, David?
Well, first of all, I don't actually think that in any of the scandals that have been swirling around Canadian politics that people have been offered an apology in the way that Jamie and Kathleen and I talk about apologies on this show. For it to be a meaningful apology in public life, it's the same rules as in private life. If you're unprepared to identify what you're apologizing for, it's not a real apology. And if you don't appear to really think it was wrong what you did, it's not a real apology. And if it ends with let's move on, it's not a real apology. And so I don't think that, first of all, that there's been a real apology in this case that people accept from Mr. Ford. But second of all, in a normal case that Jamie's talking about, you have most leaders have people around them who are trusted, who can have those difficult personal conversations, and even if they're not on staff, you can draw them in to make the pitch to the leader that they've got to change course and that they've got to acknowledge this problem. In Mr. Ford's case, he seems to be surrounded both in family and in his personal life by people who are entirely enablers or worse. So I don't actually know what you would do in that circumstance.
Help me with this, and that's to try to understand the obligations, the responsibilities of people like you, people in your position as staffers. When you firmly believe that your boss has done something wrong, you've tried the direct talk and it hasn't seemed to work. Beyond that, what's your responsibility? What's your obligation, Kathleen?
Well, I think, people who work in political life, political staffers, have the public interest at heart. And I think there isn't any public interest in just gossip. There isn't any public interest in just diving into the personal lives of political figures. But when it crosses the line, when something a public figure has done crosses the line in terms of judgment or could impact their job, I think that the staffer has a responsibility in terms of their own integrity and in terms of why they got into political life in the first place to help the public to resign. And I think that's what we've actually seen in this office over the last number of months.
David?
Well, in the case of a mayoralty, it's unique because people who work for the mayor are working for an individual and they have only one sort of interest in that regard. In addition to, I do want to reinforce what Kathleen said, the vast majority of people working in politics have the public interest at mind, so that's always a factor. But in most of the situations that Kathleen or Jamie or I would find ourselves in, there'd be a political party as well, which also has an interest. So there's an institutional interest and an individual interest. And the individual interest is just one of the things that you have to consider. And different leaders have different types of staff. Some people have staffs that are very personal to them and are primarily loyal to them. Other leaders, mostly after they've been in office for a while, have staff who come from the party and who are at least as loyal to the party as they are to that leader. And so there are a number of interests one has to balance, but certainly unless your only reason in politics is to keep that particular person in office, there are lines that when they cross jeopardize institutional interests and jeopardize the public interest, and it's the staff person's obligation to try to address that.
Peter, I agree with both David and Kathleen on that point, but there's a long, big distance before you get to that point. And that's the advisors or staffers' job. It's to stop things from getting to that point. And it's to be persuasive, and it's to be a powerful, rigorous, intellectually honest advocate for what you believe, to bring in other advisors, family advisors, other advisors from outside the office, whatever you've got to do to get your point across in order to have, your boss see it the way that you think is important. Sure, there's a line at which you say, I'm out of here, I can't do this anymore. But really, the good staffers are working very hard to make sure you never bump up against that electric fence.
All right, I only got a couple of minutes left. I want to try to deal with this one other scenario, totally different than that one. You're working for somebody who clearly has problems when they're, either in an interview or a scrum or a Q&A session at a town hall. They tend to go on too long, or they end up putting their foot in their mouth. And there's a kind of a record of it. You've seen it over time. How do you deal with that? What do you do? What do you say, David?
Well, I think that they're missing some elements of political communication in that instance. For example, what is interesting to say is not always, and perhaps rarely, good politics to say. We can blame this for why people are less interested in politics, perhaps, but I remember an old politician telling me many years ago that when they were doing a scrum and they saw the reporters really start to write in their notepads, that's when they knew they'd made a mistake and started to double back in their answers. And so to think of what's the most interesting or perhaps clever thing to say in a circumstance is not necessarily the most politically advisable thing to say. There are ways of working with people, with candidates, to get them more disciplined in that regard. One of the best techniques I've found is to make candidates start their answers with an overarching statement of values before they get into the weeds or the detail of the issue. And once you lay out that overarching value statement, your answer is more likely to follow logically from that place.
Jamie.
I had a candidate once who had a habit of saying not the greatest or most helpful things. And one day he said something really stupid. So I waited until he got onto the plane from Ottawa to Toronto. And when he was in the air, I issued a statement on his behalf apologizing, handed it to him when he got off the plane. He came roaring into the office screaming, "How dare you do that?" I said, "How dare you be so stupid?" We yelled and screamed at each other. The next morning we kissed and made up. And from that day to this, never made that mistake again.
That's hilarious.
You're lucky on that one. Kathleen, you get the last word here.
Well, I think that every party has problems, whether it's your leader or whether it's an MP. I think in terms of leader, it can be greater if you've got a leader that tends to put their foot in their mouth time and time again, mainly because it goes to a party brand issue or a party identity issue. And so that's where, as David has mentioned, training comes involved. You need to do that time and time again. Or with MPs or candidates, there's lots of discipline that can be done to kind of keep that loose cannon under control, whether it's stripping them of caucus duties or sending them on trips so they can't get in trouble. To Jamie's point, maybe just keep them on that plane for a little bit longer so they can't get in any more trouble.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Good advice. We'll see who's listening. All right. Thanks, Kathleen, who is in Ottawa tonight. Jamie's in Vancouver. David here in Toronto.